Three puppies were hanging from an overpass, bound, gagged, and left to die. What Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks found that night wasn't just animal cruelty, it was the beginning of a buried military secret. Here's what happened, but before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The sun was dying behind the Arizona desert, bleeding orange and rust across a sky too wide and too quiet. The wind dragged heat across the cracked highway, lifting dust into slow-moving spirals that danced and vanished before they could touch anything. It was the kind of silence that made a man listen to things better left unheard, especially a man like Elijah Brooks. Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks hadn't meant to be on this road. His GPS had glitched 10 miles back, rerouting him off the interstate and onto this forgotten stretch of Highway 86. A shortcut, it said, but no shortcut could detour what Elijah had carried with him since Fallujah. Memories carved too deep for time to touch. The radio crackled with static, then silence. He didn't bother fixing it. His truck hummed low, tires gritting against the pavement. His eyes were on the road, but his mind was somewhere else, on a folded flag sitting on his dresser, on the way his squad used to laugh when the world still made sense, on a dog named Barricade who once saved his life with a snarl and a sprint. He was still thinking about that dog when he saw something that didn't belong. It was just a flicker, something swinging unnaturally from the overpass up ahead, a thin, jerking movement above the traffic lanes. At first, he thought it was debris, maybe a tarp caught in the railings, the kind of thing desert wind likes to toy with. But then the setting sun hit it just right, and he saw it clearly. Three shapes, small, hanging. Elijah's chest seized. He hit the brakes hard. The truck screeched to a stop, fishtailing slightly on the loose gravel shoulder. The engine idled as Elijah flung open the door and sprinted toward the embankment. His boots kicked up dust as he scrambled up the slope, hands gripping rocks and weeds until he reached the top. That's when his heart stopped. Three puppies, German shepherds, barely old enough to walk, their legs bound with zip ties, their muzzles wrapped with black electrical tape, and their necks looped with thin wire, strung through the overpass railing like meat hung in a butcher's window. They were still alive. Barely. One of them twitched weakly, its back leg jerking as if trying to run in midair. Another's chest rose and fell in uneven gasps. The third hung limp, eyes closed, a line of drool tracing its mouth down to the road below. Elijah didn't think. He moved. He dropped to his knees and pulled a knife from his pocket. Military issue. The same blade that once cut through desert tents and tripwire. His hands, steady even in gunfire, trembled now as he reached for the wires. "Hang in there," he muttered. "Just a second, I've got you." The first pup was closest. The wire had sliced partway into its neck, but it was still breathing. Elijah slid the blade between the wire and fur and sawed gently. The metal gave way with a snap, and the puppy collapsed into his arms, light as a whisper. Shaking. He laid it down and moved to the second. This one fought. Its eyes fluttered open, and for a heartbeat, Elijah saw fire in them. Panic, painega, and something else. A will to live. He cut the second wire fast, catching the pup before it hit the ground. And then the third, the smallest. The wire was thinner, tighter. It had almost done its job. The puppy wasn't breathing. Elijah's throat clenched. "No, no, no," he whispered, cradling the limp body. He placed it on the concrete, removed the tape from its mouth, and began chest compressions. Tiny, careful presses, just like he remembered from the combat medkit training back in Kandahar. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Nothing. He tried again. "Come on, little one, come back." Then, like a miracle wrapped in dust, it gasped. A shallow, broken wheeze. Its chest rose. Elijah let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding and scooped the pup up, holding it against his chest. He looked around. No cameras, no witnesses, just desert and death in a silence that should have stayed sacred. But whoever did this, they didn't want these dogs gone quietly. They wanted them displayed. A warning. Or worse, a signature. Elijah stood there for a long time, cradling all three pups in the curve of his arms. They were barely alive, but alive nonetheless. And as he turned back toward his truck, heart pounding and mind racing, one thought surged louder than the rest. This wasn't random. This was war. The truck's tires screamed against the asphalt as Elijah tore back onto the highway, hazard lights flashing like a heartbeat he couldn't control. The pups were bundled in the passenger seat, wrapped in his faded army field jacket, three fragile bodies tucked into cloth that had seen sandstorms and sniper fire, but never anything like this. The smallest one, the one he'd brought back with chest compressions, let out a thin, pained cry. Elijah's hand shot out instinctively, steadying the pup's trembling body. "You're okay," he said, his voice too tight. "You're okay now, stay with me." The sun had dipped below the line of the desert, turning the sky a deep bruised purple. Shadows stretched across the road like fingers. Every mile felt like 10. His eyes flicked between the road and the pups. The bigger one was breathing fast, his side heaving like a bellows. The middle one lay still, eyes open and watching Elijah with a haunted, wordless stare that somehow looked too human. His GPS wasn't working. It hadn't worked all day. But he remembered a sign 12 miles back, a vet clinic near a feed store on Route 18. Maybe still open, maybe not. It didn't matter. That was the only shot they had. "You don't get to quit," Elijah muttered, pressing harder on the gas. "You're fighters. I can see it in your eyes." The truck bounced as he veered onto a side road, barely slowing down for the turn. Dust exploded behind him, but he didn't care. Not now. As he drove, his thoughts spiraled, fast, unfiltered, like they always did in moments of crisis. Except this wasn't a battlefield. There were no insurgents, no gunfire, just three tiny lives slipping through his fingers and a sickening truth taking shape in his gut. This wasn't neglect. This was planned. The wire, the zip ties, the way they were hung, not to die instantly, but to suffer, to be seen. And the tape, Elijah had removed it from their muzzles with shaking hands. It had been wrapped clean, precise, not like some junkyard punk's half-assed job. Someone had known what they were doing. The truck fishtailed slightly as he spotted a wooden sign up ahead. Cactus Ridge Veterinary Clinic. 1 mile, his breath caught. He pushed the pedal harder. 30 seconds later, he screeched into the gravel parking lot, headlights lighting up a white stucco building with a flickering neon open sign. He grabbed the jacket with the pups and ran, boots slamming against the ground, heart pounding. A bell jingled violently as he burst through the clinic door. A woman in scrubs behind the counter looked up, startled. She was middle-aged, with deep lines around her eyes and hands that looked like they'd held too many dying things. "Help," Elijah gasped. "Puppies! They were someone, please." She was already on her feet, eyes locked on the bundle in his arms. "Back room," she ordered. "Now." He followed her past the front desk, past cages and kennels, into a small exam room where a younger vet tech was prepping supplies. The woman took the smallest puppy first, laying it on a steel table. The pup's eyes fluttered open, then closed again. "Dehydrated, malnourished, possible strangulation trauma," she muttered. "Get fluids in all three, stat." Elijah stood frozen for a moment, the blood still rushing in his ears. Then he realized the brown one was trying to crawl out of the jacket, legs too weak to support him. Elijah gently placed him on the second table, where the vet tech began examining him. The woman turned to Elijah. "I need you to tell me everything." He swallowed. Highway 86 overpass. Someone tied them by the neck, zip ties on their legs, tape on their mouths. They were hanging there, alive. She stared at him for a second, then she nodded once, grim. "Whoever did this meant for them to be found," she said. "I think," Elijah hesitated, "I think they were supposed to die." The woman didn't answer. She just turned back to the pups, her jaw tight. Minutes passed, then hours. Elijah sat in the corner of the exam room, his hands still stained with dust and something darker. He watched them fight, tiny chests rising and falling, trembling limbs twitching in sleep or pain or both. Around midnight, the vet approached quietly and crouched beside him. "They're stable," she said. "Still touch and go, but they've got fight." Elijah exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Thank you. She hesitated. There's something else. He looked up. The smallest one has a scar inside her ear, barely visible, but I know what it is. Tattoo ink. Elijah's breath caught. I saw it once before, the vet said. Years ago, military-bred litters, service dog programs. He stood slowly. You're sure? She nodded. No civilian breeder marks a pup like that. Elijah turned to the table where the smallest pup now slept, her body curled tight like she was still hanging, still waiting for the end to come. And just like that, the quiet returned. But this time it was different. It didn't feel like peace. It felt like a storm on the horizon, and because this wasn't over. And Elijah Brooks wasn't the kind of man who turned his back on war. The tires hummed low as Elijah's truck rolled back through the dark, winding desert road toward the old ranch. 3 pups tucked into a makeshift crate in the back seat, wrapped in soft towels the vet had pressed into his hands before he left. You saved them, she'd said, not looking him in the eye. But I don't think this is the end of it. Be careful. He hadn't answered. He didn't have to. The air outside the truck was thick with night and memory, the kind of blackness that doesn't just hide the stars. It swallows you whole. Elijah could feel it pressing in on him. Not just the desert, but the past. The things he'd buried so deep they stopped having names. The wind moved like whispers, and his thoughts, once again, drifted to war. To Barricade, the canine that had served alongside his unit. Jet black, lean, always alert. He remembered the way the dog would sit beside him on night watch. Not moving, not even blinking. Like he too was waiting for something that would never come. Barricade had died in Elijah's arms after a roadside bomb sent their convoy flying into the sky like toys tossed by a giant. The only reason Elijah survived was because Barricade lunged first, sniffed it out, tackled him behind the Humvee, and took the brunt of the explosion. Elijah still carried the harness, buried at the bottom of a duffel bag he never unpacked. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. The scar on his left forearm, the one shaped like a crescent, throbbed like it always did when the past came knocking. He looked in the rearview mirror. 3 puppies, sleeping now, breathing, live. He hadn't been able to save Barricade, but these 3, maybe this was his second chance. As the ranch came into view, low and wide under the moonlight, its wooden fence barely holding back the wilderness, Elijah felt something shift inside him. A quiet sort of fire. Not rage, not grief, purpose. He pulled into the gravel drive and parked near the old barn. As he opened the truck door, the smallest pup stirred. Her eyes opened, just a sliver, and fixed on him. Just for a moment. Then they closed again. He carried the crate inside, past the front porch where his uncle used to sit and sip coffee laced with whiskey, past the living room where nothing had changed in 6 years. Same cracked leather couch, same photos on the wall. A younger Elijah smiling in a dress uniform beside a father he hadn't spoken to since the funeral. He set the crate down in the laundry room. It was warm there, quiet and away from the drafty windows. He lined it with towels and added a bowl of water. Then he sat and waited. The hours stretched long. The smallest pup whimpered in her sleep. The brown one, the heaviest, kicked a paw in the air like he was chasing something. And the third, dark-furred and sharper-featured, simply stared at Elijah. Not like a dog, like a soldier, watching, waiting. There was something in his eyes Elijah couldn't place. Not fear, not even pain. It was focus, instinct. A few minutes later, the dark pup sat up, slowly, shakily, and crawled to the edge of the crate. Elijah moved without thinking, kneeling beside it, offering his hand. The pup didn't flinch, didn't sniff, just pressed his forehead to Elijah's palm and closed his eyes. Elijah felt his throat tighten. You've seen things, haven't you? He whispered. Or maybe it's just in your blood. He sat there until sunrise, back against the laundry room wall, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of 3 lives that weren't supposed to exist anymore. Then, just as the sun breached the ridge and cast golden light across the tiled floor, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered. No voice. just breathing. And then the call ended. He stared at the screen. The last four digits of the number were 7624, the same numbers tattooed inside the smallest pup's ear. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. Someone knew, and they weren't finished. Elijah stood at the window, unmoving. The phone still sat on the kitchen counter behind him. Screen dark now, silent. But the tension hadn't faded. Not from the call, not from the number, and not from the sick certainty crawling through his gut. This wasn't coincidence. That number hadn't been a glitch. Whoever had hung those pups from the overpass knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew he had them now. Outside, the Arizona morning bloomed. Blue skies, gold sun, a breeze that smelled like dust and sagebrush. But inside the house, the air felt like it had turned to glass, thin, tight, ready to shatter. The smallest pup, he'd started calling her Raya, after a medic from his unit, whimpered softly from the crate. She was still too weak to stand on her own, but every hour she lasted gave him hope. The brown one had taken to snoring lightly, stretched out like he owned the place, belly rising and falling. Elijah had named him Diesel, half as a joke, half because he grunted like an old truck when he slept. But the third one, the dark pup, that one still hadn't closed his eyes. He sat in the crate like a sentinel, posture stiff, ears twitching at every noise outside. Elijah hadn't given him a name yet, because something about that dog made him hesitate. He didn't feel like a puppy, he felt like a partner. Elijah turned from the window and opened the folder he'd pulled from the ranch's attic the night before. His late uncle, James Brooks, had been a contractor after the Marines. Quiet about the details, never spoke much. Just said the government wanted things done quick and quiet. Elijah hadn't thought much of it until now. Inside the folder were old invoices, faded blueprints, and a photocopied letterhead he hadn't noticed before. Cerberus Tactical Solutions. Confidential. Project Cerberus. Classified disposition. He flipped the page. A list of canine litters, breeding logs, numbers, percentile ranks, each pup listed with a unique tattoo code. His fingers scanned the rows until they stopped. 7624, female 6 weeks, subject to disposition protocol 12B. He blinked. Disposition. He knew that word from the field. It didn't mean adoption. It meant termination. Elijah slammed the folder shut. They weren't just abandoned. They were erased on purpose. No questions, no paper trail. Just discarded like defective parts. His heart pounded. The sweat on his palms wasn't from heat. He looked back at the crate, at Rhea's frail form curled into the towel, her tiny chest still fighting to rise and fall. They weren't meant to survive, he whispered. And suddenly he knew. These pups weren't just strays. They were born into a system designed to turn them into weapons, until someone decided they weren't worth the cost. And now they were loose, and someone wanted them gone, for good. A car drove by outside, slow, too slow for a back road like this. Elijah ducked to the side of the window and peeked out. Black sedan, no plates, no dust trail behind it, meaning it had been parked nearby before it moved. He waited, held his breath. The car didn't stop. It rolled past the fence, then disappeared behind a hill. But the message was clear. We see you. He turned to the pups. I'm not letting you go, he said. Not to them, not to anyone. He pulled an old lockbox from the coat closet, spun the combination, and opened it. Inside was everything he hadn't touched since the war. Military whistle, gloves, a sidearm still oiled, his old tack watch, and a folded harness marked K9, active duty. He laid it on the table, then turned back to the pups. They called you rejects, he said. Mistakes. He looked at the dark one, still watching him, eyes locked, steady. I call you a survivor. And for the first time since the overpass, the pup gave a single silent nod of his head. Not like a trick, not like a game, like he understood. The next morning broke with a sky the color of steel and a wind that whispered through the broken fence posts like something was coming. Elijah stood barefoot into the kitchen, coffee in hand, staring at the open file spread across the table. The folder looked harmless, just yellowed pages, creased corners, paper clips rusted from time. But its contents, they were soaked in blood without it ever showing a drop. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. Not with that black sedan still etched in his memory, cruising by like a predator, scenting its prey. He kept the pups in the laundry room all night, the old door barricaded with a dresser and his service pistol under the pillow. The desert had gone quiet again, but this time the silence didn't comfort. It stalked. Elijah flipped back to the breeding logs. The pages didn't list names, just numbers, genetic traits, and cryptic notations. Batch 14D, high aggression, reassigned. Batch 16B, exceptional obedience, redeployed overseas. And then Batch 20A, unstable behavioral variants, disposition scheduled. He found them. 7624, 7625, 7626. Raya, Diesel, and the unnamed Dark One. Every entry had a final note. Do not attempt reconditioning. Destroy documentation following termination. Elijah swallowed it. Whoever wrote that didn't expect anyone to find this file. And if they knew it had resurfaced, they'd come for it, just like they came for the punks. His hand shook, the coffee cooling in his grip. He thought of Raya, her breath shallow and body fragile, but fighting harder than most grown men he'd seen in combat. Diesel, clumsy and loud, but full of heart. And the Dark One, the one who hadn't looked away since the first moment they locked eyes. He thought of Barricade again. The night that dog died, saving his life, Elijah made a silent promise to never forget. He just hadn't expected to be reminded this way. He needed answers, not guesses, not scraps. The kind of answers only someone inside the system could give. There was one name on a loose document in the file, handwritten in fading blue ink. The only piece that didn't look typed, clean, or sanitized. Dr. Meredith Shaw, Canine Behavioral Division, San Marcos, NM. The name rang a bell. Faint, buried. Elijah had heard it once, maybe twice, during a mission briefing years ago. The kind of name passed around by handlers in the know. Behavioral expert, specialized in tactical dog psychology. Off the radar for the last 5 years. But her name shouldn't have been here, and that made it matter. Elijah folded the papers, slid them into a sealed envelope, and tucked it beneath the floorboard under the couch. A trick his uncle taught him, long before either of them knew how to spell PTSD. Then he geared up, boots, jacket, whistle, sidearm, the duffel bag he swore he'd never open again. And finally, the old K9 harness. He looked over at the pups as they stirred. Diesel wagged his tail, thumping the towel like a drumbeat. Raya blinked up at him weakly. The Dark One, he was already sitting, still as stone, waiting for direction. You coming? Elijah asked. The dark pup tilted his head, then stood, slow but steady. That was answer enough. They weren't going back to the program. They weren't going to be erased, and if someone wanted these pups to disappear, they'd have to bury Elijah first. He opened the front door. The desert wind hit him like breath from a sleeping beast. It smelled like smoke, like gasoline. He turned toward the barn. There was fire. The flames were already licking at the roof by the time Elijah reached the barn. The dry timbers snapped like bones in the heat, smoke curling into the air in long black ribbons. Sparks danced across the dirt like angry fireflies. The blaze had started fast, accelerant no doubt, and it was no accident. Elijah didn't hesitate. He charged through the side door just before it collapsed, covering his mouth with his sleeve. Inside, the air was thick and hot, filled with the crackle of dying wood and the stink of scorched hay. The storage loft, where he'd kept extra food, blankets, supplies, was already gone. But there was no one inside. No pups, no bodies, just destruction. By the time he staggered back out, coughing, eyes burning, the neighbors were starting to gather at the edge of the property line. 2 trucks idling, a man and a woman standing with their hands on their hips, looking like they didn't know whether to approach or call the fire department. Elijah waved them off. It's under control, he croaked, voice raw. Go back home. They did. In a town like this, people didn't ask questions unless you wanted them to. And Elijah had always been the kind of man people didn't want to cross. He stood there watching the barn collapse inward with a groan of surrender. Everything inside was lost, tools, gear, what little was left of his uncle's old life. Except the fire wasn't the point. It was a message, and it had been delivered. He turned around, scanning the horizon. That's when he saw it. A black Dodge Charger, parked at the edge of the property, half hidden behind a curtain of mesquite trees. Sleek, shiny, silent, engine still running. Elijah's chest tightened. His instincts lit up like flares. He stepped toward it slowly, one hand hovering near his waistband where the Glock rested, the other still smeared with soot. The pup, still unnamed, stood beside him, growling low, his fur bristling. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. Lean, late 40s, wearing a gray suit that didn't belong in the desert, aviator sunglasses, polished shoes, not a single drop of sweat on him, despite the rising heat. Elijah Brooks, the man said, not as a question. You got the wrong ranch, Elijah replied. The man smiled thinly. I don't think I do. He reached into his jacket, and for a breathless second, Elijah tensed. But it wasn't a gun. It was a black leather case, the kind used to carry contracts or threats. I represent a private security organization, the man continued. Our property was misplaced recently. We believe you may have recovered it. Elijah didn't move. If you're talking about the pups, they're not yours. They were part of a highly specialized training protocol, the man said, calmly ignoring the smoke curling behind them. Property of Cerberus Tactical Solutions. Their survival was not intended. They were hanging from a bridge, Elijah snapped, left to die. A miscommunication, the man said smoothly. Mistakes happen. Elijah stepped forward. The pup growled louder now, body tense, every muscle on edge. You call that a mistake? Elijah said. I call it attempted murder. The man tilted his head. We could have this conversation with lawyers, or we could resolve it now, quietly. I'm not giving them up. The man exhaled, not frustrated, just disappointed. You're a soldier, he said. You understand orders, collateral damage, necessary ends. No, Elijah said flatly. I understand loyalty. I understand that when something broken looks at you and trusts you to fix it, you don't hand it back to the people who broke it. A silence settled between them. Then the man stepped back, closing the car door behind him. I hope you know what you're doing, he said. They weren't just rejected for fun, Sergeant. They were rejected for a reason. He climbed into the Charger and drove off. No threats, no promises, just smoke in his wake. Elijah stood there long after the car disappeared. The barn was gone, but the line had been drawn, and now he knew what they were willing to do. They didn't want the dogs back. They wanted them erased. The desert quiet returned that night, but it wasn't peace. It was a held breath, the kind that comes before a storm breaks across the sky. See, the barn still smoldered behind the house, embers glowing faintly in the dark like dying stars. Elijah sat on the porch, boots in the dust, shotgun resting across his lap. The pups were inside, finally asleep. Raya curled against the space heater. Diesel sprawled across an old rug like he owned the place. And the dark one, Elijah still hadn't named him, lay by the front door, eyes closed but ears twitching at every creak of wood, every shifting wind. He wasn't just alert, he was listening and waiting, just like Elijah. Earlier that day, after the Charger disappeared down the road, Elijah had gone digging, this time deeper. He'd returned to the file, scanned the faded stamps, made phone calls using burner apps, sent encrypted emails to old friends from the service. And one name kept coming up. Maximus. Not a man, a dog, a legend. Maximus had been the highest performing military canine in the field during Operation Crescent Strike, credited with saving over 20 lives in active combat. There were medals, there was even a documentary in the works, until he died in a bombing during extraction. But not before siring a final litter, bred for precision, obedience, instinct, then classified, then erased. Elijah looked down at the piece of paper he now held in his hand, a genetic lineage chart emailed to him by a quietly furious vet tech. who owed him a favor. At the top, Maximus, KIA. And beneath it, 7626, male, unstable temperament, immediate disposal recommended. He didn't need to guess. That was the dark pup. The one who didn't flinch, didn't bark, didn't break eye contact. The one who had already positioned himself between Elijah and danger more than once, without command or training. A disposable animal with combat awareness in his blood. Elijah stared at the sleeping pup through the window. His breathing was steady, calm. But when Elijah quietly lifted the latch on the window to test for a sound, the pup opened his eyes. No bark, no growl, just a look. Steady, focused, present. Elijah stood, walked inside, and sat on the floor. The pup padded over and sat beside him, pressing his body against Elijah's leg like armor. "You're his," Elijah whispered. "You're Maximus's son." He said it like it mattered. Because it did. It wasn't just bloodline, it was legacy. It was proof that loyalty, instinct, and courage weren't things that could be programmed or erased with paperwork. They were passed down like fire. And this pup, who had been labeled unstable, dangerous, unfit, had already proven more composed and aware than half the men Elijah had served with overseas. He placed a hand gently on the pup's head. The fur was coarse, warm, grounding. "You're not a reject," and he said. "You're a fighter, just like your father." The pup licked his fingers once, then rested his chin on Elijah's boot. That was the moment he knew. This dog wasn't just watching. He'd already chosen. The next morning came without ceremony. Just pale light bleeding through the blinds and the scent of scorched earth still lingering in the air. Elijah woke on the couch, his shoulders sore from sleeping on the shotgun again. The pup, now christened Ghost because he moved like one, was curled beside him, half under the blanket, half alert as always. Elijah rubbed the sleep from his eyes and rose slowly. The house was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. It was watchful. Raya and Diesel were in the laundry room, playing now, finally strong enough to waddle without falling over every few steps. Their tails wagged. They were healing. He poured himself coffee, black and bitter, and stared out the window toward the blackened husk that used to be his barn. The air around it was still scorched. The fire had been controlled. But the threat wasn't gone. It had just begun. At 9:14 a.m., a sheriff's cruiser pulled up the drive. Elijah stepped onto the porch before the dust had even settled. The door opened, and out stepped Sheriff Lena Ortiz, broad-shouldered, early 50s, and wearing a lawman's face that didn't need a badge to command respect. Her dark eyes scanned the property like she already knew everything that had happened. "Elijah," she said as she approached, "heard about the fire." "I didn't call it in," Elijah said flatly. "I know. Neighbors did. You're lucky they didn't see what really happened." She paused at the base of the porch, not quite stepping up, waiting. He nodded once and she joined him. They sat in silence for a moment, the wind rustling dry leaves across the steps. "You still carrying?" she asked, not accusing, just confirming. "Always," she nodded. "Good. You might need it." He looked over at her. "You came here for more than a welfare check." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded manila envelope, handed it to him without a word. Inside were two photographs. One showed a litter of puppies, 6 total, freshly born, eyes still closed, huddled against their mother. German Shepherds. The mother's tag was visible in the background. Delta 09, Cerberus K9 Division. The second photo made his stomach turn. Same litter, but this time only 3 pups remained. They were in a metal crate in what looked like a warehouse. A clipboard rested on top of the crate with one word printed in red ink. Disposition. "These were leaked last year," Lena said quietly. "A whistleblower from inside Cerberus claimed the program was disposing of dogs for instability, but there were signs of abuse, mutilation, psychological trauma. No official investigation ever opened. Funding pulled. Facility scrubbed clean." "Where was it?" "New Mexico. San Marcos. Some joint venture between Cerberus and a private tech firm. On paper, it doesn't exist anymore." Elijah's jaw clenched. "Except it does." Lena looked out at the horizon. "I had a call this morning, untraceable. voice masked. They told me to stay away from you, that you were harboring government property, that if I helped you, I'd lose my badge. You here to arrest me? No, she shook her head. I'm here to warn you. You're on someone's list now, and they don't knock twice. He exhaled through his nose. They already torched my barn. That was just a whisper. The next move will be louder. She leaned forward, voice low. They're not just cleaning up a mess, Elijah. They're erasing it. No headlines, no trials, no bodies. He looked back toward the house where Ghost now sat watching from the window, head tilted like he was listening through the glass. I'm not letting them take these dogs, Elijah said. I don't care what they were bred for. Lena nodded. Then you need to disappear for a while. Train them, get them strong, because when they come back, they won't come with fire. Elijah stood. I don't run. I didn't say run, Lena said, rising too. I said prepare. She reached into her jacket one last time and handed him a key. To an old safe house. My brother used it after he left the DEA. Off-grid, west of Buckeye. You'll find what you need there. Elijah took the key, and with it the responsibility. Not just for the pups, for the truth. As Lena drove off down the dusty road, Ghost padded up beside him, sitting silently at his heel. And Elijah knew. This wasn't about protecting puppies anymore. This was about standing in front of the kind of darkness that buried things too inconvenient to remember, and refusing to let it bury them. The wind shifted just after midnight. Elijah felt it before he heard it. The subtle way the desert went still, how even the coyotes had stopped crying to the moon. Inside the safe house, an old adobe structure buried in the far reaches of Buckeye's forgotten outskirts. The air was thick with heat and warning. He sat by the window, fully dressed, shotgun resting across his lap, sidearm tucked in his waistband. Ghost lay beside him, ears twitching, eyes never blinking. Diesel and Rhea were asleep in the wet room, their breathing soft and shallow. They were stronger now, but not ready. Not for what was coming. The house was dark, every light off, every creaking floorboard mapped and memorized. Elijah had been a soldier long enough to know when silence meant danger, and tonight the desert was holding its breath. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the brush, just beyond the property line. One figure, then another. Low, methodical, tactical. Elijah stood, slow and quiet, motioning for Ghost to stay close. The dog didn't move, didn't bark, just shifted beside him like a shadow stretching in moonlight. They came fast. Two men from the front, dressed in desert camo, their steps nearly soundless. Another circled to the back. Elijah counted 4. Maybe more. The kind of men who didn't wear badges. The kind who didn't call for warrants. They weren't here to arrest anyone. They were here to clean up. Elijah crouched near the front door, gripping the shotgun. He didn't want to shoot, not unless he had to, but he wasn't letting anyone through that threshold without a fight. The quiet click echoed from the back window. Then another, a breach attempt. Elijah moved like instinct. He crossed the room in 3 strides, flicked the latch on the side window, and shoved it open hard. A figure stumbled back, cursing under his breath. Move again, Elijah growled, and I'll leave more than a warning. There was a pause, then retreating footsteps, fast and uncoordinated. Not trained military. Mercs. Contractors. Hired to erase, not survive. Then came the real test. The front door. A shadow moved just outside the frosted glass. No knock, just a low hum, a handheld saw whispering against the lock. Ghost growled deep in his throat. Elijah knelt beside him, whispered, "Guard." The pup stood, steady and silent, and moved to the door like he'd done it 100 times. He lowered his body, positioning himself just behind the doorframe. Then the saw stopped. Click. The door creaked inward an inch. And Ghost exploded, a black blur, a snarl of fury and precision. He launched through the half-open door and collided with the intruder with enough force to send them both sprawling into the dirt. Elijah was right behind him, shotgun raised. "Don't move," he barked. The man on the ground groaned, bleeding from the arm, Ghost's teeth still bared inches from his throat. A second figure stepped into view behind the porch railing, weapon raised. Too slow. Elijah fired. The blast rang across the desert like thunder. The second figure dove for cover, disappearing into the brush. "Ghost, back!" Elijah ordered. The dog obeyed instantly, sprinting back in height as Elijah kicked the door shut and latched it. It was quiet again, except for the ringing in his ears and the adrenaline flooding his veins. He rushed to the back room. Raya and Diesel were awake now, wide-eyed and trembling. But safe, Elijah dropped to his knees, checked their breathing, stroked their heads. "You're okay," he whispered. "They're not getting you, not tonight, not ever." His phone buzzed. No caller ID. He answered without a word. A voice came through, calm, robotic, and cold. "You've made this harder than it had to be." Elijah didn't flinch. "You're not taking them. They're assets. You're interfering with federal protocol. They're dogs, and you tried to kill them." A pause, then. "You're not walking away from this, Staff Sergeant Brooks. Not this time." The line went dead. Elijah sat in the dark, phone in one hand, shotgun in the other, Ghost curled protectively beside him. Outside, no more footsteps, no more movement. But it wasn't over. This was the warning, the final one. The next time, they wouldn't come in the dark. They had come in daylight with clean suits, forged orders, and silenced weapons. And when they did, Elijah would be waiting with 3 deaths once marked for death. And a truth they couldn't bury. The sun rose like it had something to prove, sharp, bright, and unforgiving. It painted the desert in gold and fire, burning away the shadows of the night before. But the damage had already been done. Inside the safe house, Elijah packed slowly, methodically. The place had served its purpose. It had bought them time. Nothing more. Raya was curled on the couch now, stronger, her eyes clearer, the trembling in her legs nearly gone. Diesel was bouncing from one corner to the next, testing his strength, his paws too big for his growing body. And Ghost. Ghost sat by the door, still as ever, watching the driveway with eyes that saw more than any puppy should. They were survivors now. But Elijah knew something deeper. They were witnesses, witnesses to a cruelty that was never meant to be seen. And maybe that was why the suits wanted them gone. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were defective, but because they were living proof that the system had failed and lived. He loaded the crate into the truck bed, gently lifting each pup inside. Ghost resisted at first, not out of fear, but duty, like he didn't want to turn his back on the last battleground. Elijah rested a hand on the dog's back. "This isn't retreat," he said quietly. "It's strategy." Ghost finally climbed in. They drove for hours west through empty roads, avoiding highways, phones off. Elijah stopped only once, to make a call, not to the sheriff, not to anyone official. He called a man named Marcus Blanchard, a journalist who once rode with their unit in Iraq, the kind of man who didn't flinch when the truth turned ugly. Elijah gave him everything: the documents, the names, the photos, the coordinates, the evidence they'd tried to erase with fire and fear and blood. By nightfall, it was online. Within 24 hours, it was everywhere. The story exploded across veteran networks, animal rights groups, independent media, and then national channels. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Lawsuits followed. Politicians demanded answers. Cerberus Tactical folded within a week. And Elijah? He didn't stop. He stayed quiet under the radar, but he didn't disappear. With money quietly pooled from fellow veterans, donors, and every person who saw the truth and refused to look away, he bought land outside Prescott and built something new. Not a shelter, not a kennel, a training ground for the forgotten, the thrown away, the nearly erased. Ghost became his right hand, his co-instructor, his shadow. He learned commands faster than some humans. His loyalty never wavered. His scars became symbols. Raya was adopted by a trauma counselor who specialized in helping children from abusive homes. Diesel became a support animal for a veteran with mobility issues. And Elijah? He kept working. Each year, more dogs arrived, each one with a story someone tried to bury, each one given a second chance. He never put up a sign. He didn't need one. The people who needed to find him always did. And when visitors asked how it all started, why a soldier would risk everything for a few broken dogs, he would just glance at Ghost, then at the old, scorched canine harness that hung on the wall near to the door. Because legacies don't die quietly, he'd say. They wait to be heard. And now they were heard, loud and clear,